Imagine spending 2 years planning the largest invasion in human history, and then getting stuck because of bushes. That's exactly what happened in Normandy, 1944. And soldiers were dying by the thousands because nobody could figure out how to get past hedgerows. Until one sergeant looked at a pile of German scrap metal and said 3 words that changed everything. What if we? What happened next is one of the greatest untold stories of the war. Let me get this straight. The Allied forces spent 2 years planning the largest military invasion in human history. They assembled 3 million soldiers. They built fake armies to fool Hitler. They created floating harbors, specialized tanks, and underwater pipelines. And then they landed in Normandy and got completely stuck because of the bushes. Not enemy tanks, not artillery, not machine gun nests. Bushes. Sounds insane, right? How could the mightiest military force ever assembled get stopped by vegetation? Well, these weren't ordinary bushes. And what happened next is one of the greatest untold stories of World War II. Because one sergeant, a guy who wasn't an engineer, wasn't an officer, and definitely wasn't supposed to be designing tank modifications, looked at a pile of German scrap metal and had an idea that changed everything. Within 11 days, 500 tanks were transformed into hedge-cutting monsters. The Germans, who had been slaughtering Americans in the French countryside, suddenly found themselves facing what they called the Devil's Fork, and the entire war shifted. But here's what nobody tells you about this story. The invention almost didn't happen. The sergeant who created it was nearly ignored. And the reason it worked so well? It was made from the very obstacles the Germans had built to stop the Allied invasion. Yeah, the Nazis literally provided the materials for their own defeat. You can't make this stuff up. Let's go back to the beginning. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. D-Day, the most famous military operation in history. Over 156,000 Allied troops stormed 5 beaches across a 50-mile stretch of the French coastline. Paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines. Naval bombardments shake the earth. Landing craft rushing toward fortified positions. The world was watching. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. And the casualties were horrific. On Omaha Beach alone, over 2,000 Americans were killed or wounded in just the first few hours. Bodies floated in the surf. Burning tanks littered the sand. The water turned red. But they pushed through. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had established a foothold in France. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Europe had begun. So here's the question everyone forgets to ask. If D-Day was successful, why did it take the Allies almost 2 months to break out of Normandy? Why were American soldiers still dying by the hundreds every single day for weeks after the beaches were secured? The answer is something called the bocage. And if you've never heard of it, don't worry. Neither had most of the soldiers who had to fight through it. The bocage. It sounds almost pleasant, doesn't it? Like a French pastry or a fancy wine. It was neither. It was a death trap, and the Americans walked right into it. The Norman bocage is a type of terrain unique to northwestern France. It's been there for over 1,000 years. Some hedgerows date back to Roman times. Picture this. Small agricultural fields, each one surrounded by earthen walls called hedgerows. Now, when Americans hear the word hedgerow, they picture the neat little bushes in front of suburban houses. Trimmed, decorative, maybe waist-high. What they found in Normandy was something entirely different. These hedgerows were monsters. The base was a thick earthen embankment, sometimes 4 to 6 feet high. On top of that grew dense vegetation bushes, shrubs, and trees with roots that had been intertwining for centuries. The total height could reach 12 to 15 feet, and they were everywhere. Imagine trying to fight a war in a maze. That's what Normandy was. Field after field after field, each one surrounded by walls you couldn't see through, couldn't shoot through, and couldn't drive through. The Germans knew this terrain. They'd been studying it for 4 years. The Americans were walking into a kill zone. But wait, I haven't even told you the worst part yet. Because the hedgerows weren't just obstacles, they were perfect defensive positions. And what happened when American tanks tried to get through them? Let me show you exactly why Normandy became a slaughterhouse. To understand why the hedgerows were so deadly, you need to understand how tank warfare was supposed to work in 1944. Tanks were the kings of the battlefield. They had armor that could stop rifle bullets and most machine gun fire. They had cannons that could destroy enemy positions from a distance. They were mobile fortresses. The whole idea was to use tanks to punch through enemy lines, creating gaps that infantry could exploit. Speed and firepower. That was the doctrine. But doctrine doesn't mean anything when your tank can't move. And in the Bocage, tanks couldn't move. Here's what happened when a Sherman tank approached a hedgerow. The driver would try to push through the vegetation. But remember, this wasn't a bush. This was a 6-foot earthen wall with centuries-old root systems holding it together. The tank couldn't push through. The embankment was too solid. So the driver would try to climb over it. And that's when soldiers died. See, when a tank climbs a steep embankment, something terrible happens. The front of the tank rises up. The belly of the tank, the thinnest, most vulnerable part of the armor, gets exposed. Picture a turtle flipping onto its back. That's what a Sherman tank looked like cresting a hedgerow. The Germans knew this. They were waiting. On the other side of every hedgerow, German soldiers would be positioned with anti-tank weapons. Panzerfausts were handheld rocket launchers that could penetrate tank armor at close range. Pack 40 anti-tank guns, sometimes even tanks of their own, hull down in prepared positions. The moment an American tank started climbing that embankment, exposing its belly, boom, one shot, tank destroyed. 5 crew members are dead or burning. And the infantry following behind, they'd be caught in the open with nowhere to hide as German machine guns opened up from hidden positions in the next hedgerow. This wasn't combat. This was systematic slaughter. Now here's where it gets even worse. Because the Americans tried to adapt. They tried different tactics, different approaches. None of them worked. Let me show you exactly how desperate the situation became. The first solution the Army tried was obvious. Don't go over the hedgerows. Go through them. They brought in bulldozers, specialized engineering vehicles. The plan was simple. Knock down the hedgerows and create paths for the tanks. Problem: bulldozers aren't armored. The moment a bulldozer approached a hedgerow, German snipers and machine gunners would target the operator. Bulldozer drivers were getting killed before they could clear even a single opening. Next idea: use explosives. Blow gaps in the hedgerows. This actually worked, sort of. Engineers could blast holes through the embankments. But there was a massive downside. Every explosion told the Germans exactly where the attack was coming from. The hedgerow maze meant the Germans didn't always know which field the Americans were in. Sound echoed weirdly. Visibility was near zero. The bocage created confusion for both sides. But a massive explosion? That was a signal. The bocage created confusion for both sides. But massive explosion? That was a signal. Third idea: forget the tanks entirely. Just send infantry through the hedgerows on foot, clear out the Germans, and then bring the tanks through safely. This was the doctrine that eventually got adopted. And it was miserable. Infantry would have to climb over the hedgerow embankments, fully exposed, dropping into the next field where Germans were dug in and waiting. Every single hedgerow was a potential death trap. Every single field could be the one where you died. The soldiers called it the War of the Hedgerows. Some called it Green Hell. And the casualty rates were staggering. Let me give you some numbers, because numbers tell the real story. In the first week after D-Day, the Americans expected to advance inland rapidly. The plan was to capture the city of St. Lo, a crucial road junction, within days. It took them 6 weeks. 6 weeks of grinding, bloody combat. Field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow. American divisions were being chewed up. The 29th Infantry Division suffered over 7,000 casualties in the bocage. The 90th Infantry Division was so badly mauled that it had to be almost entirely rebuilt. One company of around 200 men went into a hedgerow assault with full strength. By the time they cleared just 2 fields, they had fewer than 50 men left. And they had hundreds more fields to go. The question wasn't whether the Allies would eventually break through. They had more men, more tanks, more everything. The question was, how many would die first? Now, Here's what the history books often skip over. While generals were debating tactics in headquarters, the actual soldiers, the guys fighting and dying in those fields, were trying to figure out solutions on their own. Because that's what happens in war. The brass makes plans. The soldiers make it work. And in the 2nd Armored Division, one sergeant had been watching, thinking, and getting angry. Curtis Grub Cullen Jr. was not your typical war hero. He wasn't a West Point graduate. He wasn't from a military family. He was just a guy from Cranford, New Jersey, who got drafted like millions of other Americans. Before the war, he'd been a cab driver in New York City. Let that sink in. The man who was about to invent one of the most important tactical innovations of World War II drove a taxi. But here's the thing about cab drivers in 1940s New York. They were problem solvers. They knew every shortcut, every back alley, every way around obstacles. They were street smart in the truest sense. And street smarts, as it turns out, translate pretty well to war. Cullen was a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron attached to the 2nd Armored Division. His job was to scout ahead of the main force, find the enemy, and report back. In the bocage, this meant navigating the hedgerow maze while trying not to get killed. It meant watching tanks and the men inside them get destroyed day after day. Cullen saw friends die. He saw the frustration on every soldier's face that he saw the same problem repeated over and over. Tanks couldn't get through the hedgerows without exposing their bellies. And exposed tanks were dead tanks. Everyone knew the problem. Nobody had a solution. Until one day, according to legend, a fellow soldier made an offhand comment during a conversation. Now, the exact details of this moment vary depending on who's telling the story. War stories are like that. They get embellished, modified, mythologized. But the core of what happened is consistent across accounts. Some sources say a Private Roberts, others say it was Cullen himself, said something like, "Why don't we just put some saw teeth on the front of the tank and cut through the hedgerows?" It was a joke, a throwaway comment. The kind of thing soldiers say when they're frustrated and exhausted and just venting. But Cullen didn't laugh it off. He started thinking, saw teeth, cutting through. What if? The idea was simple in concept. If you attached large metal teeth to the front of a tank angled downward like a plow, the tank might be able to dig into the hedgerow embankment instead of climbing over it. Instead of riding up the wall and exposing its belly, the tank would drive forward and the teeth would rip into the dirt and roots, tearing the hedgerow apart from the bottom up. The tank would stay level. The belly would stay protected. The hedgerow would be destroyed. Simple, right? Well, here's the problem. Where do you get the metal for these teeth? The tank units were in the middle of combat operations. They didn't have access to steel factories or manufacturing plants. They were in the French countryside, surrounded by destroyed buildings and, wait, destroyed German defenses. And that's when Cullen had his second genius realization. Remember those beach obstacles I mentioned at the beginning? The ones the Germans had built to stop the Allied invasion? They were about to become the instrument of Germany's defeat. The Normandy beaches had been covered with obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft and block tanks from reaching the shore. There were several types, but the most common were what the Americans called Czech hedgehogs, or as the Germans knew them, Rommel's asparagus. These were steel beam structures, usually made of 3 or more heavy iron rails welded together in an X pattern. They were ugly, brutal, effective defensive tools. And after D-Day, there were thousands of them lying on the beaches. Useless now that the invasion had succeeded. Just scrap metal. Cullen looked at those obstacles and saw something else entirely. He saw tank teeth. The steel in those Czech hedgehogs was perfect for what Cullen had in mind. Heavy-duty iron rails, already cut into manageable sections, are designed to withstand tremendous force. They just needed to be reshaped. Cullen approached his commanding officers with the idea. He explained the concept. He showed them rough sketches. And here's where the story almost ended before it began. Because in the military, especially in 1944, enlisted men didn't design equipment modifications. That was for engineers, for specialists, for officers with degrees and clearances. A sergeant from New Jersey who used to drive a cab, telling them how to fix the tank problem? Some people laughed it off. But Cullen was persistent, and he had something more powerful than rank. he had a demonstration. With help from maintenance crews, Hewlin cobbled together a prototype. They took steel from those beach obstacles, cut it into sections, and welded 4 large teeth to the front hull of a Sherman tank. The device looked almost medieval, like a battering ram from the Dark Ages. Some soldiers called it a rhino horn. Others called it a hedgerow cutter. It looked ridiculous. It looked like something a kid would draw. And it worked. The first test was unforgettable for everyone who witnessed it. Hewlin's modified tank approached a hedgerow, the same kind of obstacle that had been killing American soldiers for weeks. The driver put the tank in gear and moved forward. The steel teeth hit the base of the embankment. They dug in. Dirt and roots started tearing free. The tank didn't ride up. The belly stayed down. The armor stayed angled toward the enemy exactly where it should be. And the hedgerow just broke apart. In under a minute, the tank had punched through the hedgerow and entered the next field, gun forward, ready to fight. The crew was protected. The passage was clear for the infantry to follow. Soldiers watching the test started cheering. Some were crying. They'd been watching friends die for weeks. And now, finally, they had an answer. But here's the thing. One successful test doesn't change a war. This prototype needed to reach the people who could actually make decisions. And that meant going up the chain of command. Fast. Because every day that passed without these devices meant more soldiers dying in those hedgerow fields. The clock was ticking. In any large organization, and the U.S. Army in 1944 was one of the largest organizations in human history, getting a new idea approved is incredibly difficult. There are procedures, protocols, chains of command that must be followed. Normally, an invention like Hewlin's would have gone through weeks or months of evaluation. Engineering tests, safety assessments, paperwork, meetings, more meetings. They didn't have weeks. They didn't have months. Soldiers were dying every single day. So Hewlin and his supporters did something unusual. They bypassed the bureaucracy. The first major officer to see the demonstration was General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army. Bradley was one of the most important generals in the European theater, second only to Eisenhower in the American command structure. He was also frustrated. Bradley had watched the Normandy campaign stall. He'd seen the casualty reports. He knew that his forces were bleeding out in the hedgerows, and he didn't have a solution. So when he heard that some sergeant had rigged up a tank modification that might work, he didn't dismiss it. He wanted to see it himself. The demonstration was held for Bradley and his staff. A Hewlin-modified Sherman tank faced off against the hedgerow. Everyone was watching. Bradley's career didn't depend on this moment. He was already a 3-star general, but the lives of his soldiers certainly did. The tank rolled forward. The teeth hit the hedgerow. And just like in the first test, the hedgerow came apart. The tank pushed through, stayed level, and emerged into the next field ready to fight. Bradley didn't hesitate. According to witnesses, he turned to his staff and said something like, "Give me as many of these as possible. Now, not evaluate this further. Not, let's see what the engineers think. Now." Bradley immediately grasped the tactical implications. If tanks could break through hedgerows without exposing their bellies, everything changed. The Germans' defensive advantage would evaporate. The Allies could finally bring their armored superiority to bear. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems. And they all came down to one thing, Time. Bradley was planning a major offensive called Operation Cobra. This was going to be the breakout from Normandy, a massive armored thrust that would shatter the German lines and open the road to Paris. The operation was scheduled for late July 1944. That gave them less than 2 weeks to manufacture, distribute, and install these devices on hundreds of tanks. 2 weeks to solve a problem that had been killing soldiers for 6 weeks. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Because what happened next wasn't just impressive, it was borderline miraculous. And it involved a lot of people you've never heard of. Bradley's order went down the chain of command at lightning speed. Within hours, ordnance units throughout the 1st Army had received instructions. Start making hedgerow cutters. Use the beach obstacles. Work around the clock. The man tasked with coordinating this effort was Lieutenant Colonel John B. Grubb, no relation to Hewlin's middle name, Just a coincidence who commanded one of the ordnance maintenance battalions. Grubb faced an almost impossible task. He needed to collect enough steel from the beach obstacles, cut that steel into the right sizes, weld those pieces onto tanks, train crews on how to use the modified vehicles, do all of this while combat operations continued, and do it in less than 2 weeks. Any sane person would have said this was impossible. The ordnance crews did anyway. Here's how they made it happen. First, salvage teams were sent back to the invasion beaches. Remember, it had only been a few weeks since D-Day. The beaches were still littered with debris, including thousands of those Czech hedgehog obstacles. It was dangerous work. Some beaches hadn't been fully cleared of mines. There were still unexploded shells in the sand. But the salvage teams went anyway. They loaded trucks with steel. Tons and tons of German beach obstacles, pulled from the sand where they'd been meant to stop the invasion. The irony was not lost on anyone. The steel was trucked to improvised workshops behind the front lines. These weren't proper factories. They were barns, garages, anywhere with enough space to set up welding equipment. And then the real work began. Welders worked in shifts around the clock. 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Some units reported welders falling asleep at their stations, being woken up, and immediately going back to work. The heat from the welding torches was intense. The summer air in Normandy was already hot and humid. Men were working in conditions that would violate every safety standard today. Nobody complained. They all knew what was at stake. Meanwhile, the design was being refined. Kuelen's original prototype worked, but could it be improved? The answer was yes, and different units developed slightly different versions. Some used 4 teeth. Some used 5 or 6. Some welded additional reinforcing bars to handle the stress of breaking through hedgerows. The basic design remained consistent. Heavy steel teeth, angled downward, attached to the front hull of the tank below the main gun. But within that framework, there was room for variation. This was field innovation in real time. No research and development lab. No testing protocols. Just soldiers figuring out what worked and implementing it immediately. The modified tanks needed nicknames. Soldiers always give nicknames. Some called them rhinoceros tanks, or rhinos for short. The teeth looked like a rhino's horn. Others called them Kuelen hedgerow cutters, crediting the inventor. But the name that stuck, the one that appeared in German intelligence reports, was something more ominous. The Devil's Fork. German soldiers who survived encounters with these tanks reported them as terrifying. 1 minute, the hedgerow was solid cover. The next minute, an American tank was crashing through it, gun blazing, infantry following. The psychological impact was almost as important as the tactical impact. Germans who had felt safe behind hedgerows suddenly felt exposed everywhere. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the Rhino tanks could terrify Germans, they had to be built, and the clock was still ticking. Let me tell you about those 11 days. The production effort began around July 14th, 1944. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 24th, though bad weather would eventually delay it by a day. That gave the ordnance units approximately 10 to 11 days to produce as many hedgerow cutters as possible. The goal was ambitious. Equip at least 3 tanks per platoon with the devices. Given the number of tank platoons in 1st Army, that meant hundreds of devices. Some accounts say they built 500. Others say it was closer to 600. The exact number is lost to the chaos of wartime record keeping. But even the conservative estimate of 500 devices in 11 days is remarkable. That's about 45 devices per day, or roughly 1 every 30 minutes around the clock. How do they do it? The answer is a combination of factors: desperation, ingenuity, and the incredible work ethic of ordinary soldiers who knew lives depended on them. Let's break it down. First, the raw materials. The Czech hedgehogs on the beaches were mostly made of railroad rails or similar heavy steel beams. This was actually ideal. Railroad steel is durable and holds up well to stress. Salvage teams worked constantly. Trucks shuttled back and forth between the beaches and the workshops. Within a few days, there was a steady supply of raw steel. One ordnance unit reported collecting over 50 tons of German beach obstacles in a single day. 50 tons. That's the weight of about 30 cars. All of it is destined to be turned into weapons against its creators. Second, the cutting. The steel beams needed to be cut into manageable sections, typically 4 to 6 feet long, depending on the design. This required acetylene torches, which could cut through heavy steel relatively quickly. The torch operators worked in brutal conditions. The heat, the sparks, the physical strain of holding the torch steady for hours at a time. And they couldn't afford mistakes. A poorly cut piece meant wasted material and wasted time. Every piece had to be right. Third, the welding. This was the bottleneck. Cutting steel is relatively fast. Welding it securely to a tank takes longer, and it requires more skill. Each hedgerow cutter needed multiple welds attaching the teeth to a mounting bracket, and then attaching the bracket to the tank. The welds had to be strong enough to withstand the tremendous force of breaking through packed earth and roots. Weak welds would fail. Failed welds meant the teeth would break off. A tank with broken teeth was useless or worse, vulnerable. So the welders took their time. But taking time is relative. They were still working faster than any peacetime safety standard would allow. Fourth, the installation. Once a device was fabricated, it needed to be mounted on a tank. This meant tanks had to be pulled out of a line, temporarily removed from combat, so the modifications could be installed. Scheduling this was a nightmare. Combat operations were ongoing. Tanks were needed at the front. But if they weren't modified, they'd be less effective once operation. Tanks would rotate back to the workshops in shifts. While one tank was being modified, another would take its place at the front. The modification process was streamlined. Welders knew exactly where to place the teeth, exactly how many welds to make. Some reports suggest that experienced crews could install a hedgerow cutter in as little as an hour. Others took longer. But the average installation time dropped steadily as the crews got more practice. By the end of the 11 days, the operation was running like a well-oiled machine. Steel in, modified, tank out. Repeat. Now here's something that often gets lost in the telling of this story. It wasn't just about the devices themselves. It was about keeping them secret. Because if the Germans found out what was coming, they'd adapt. They'd prepare countermeasures. The element of surprise was just as important as the devices. General Bradley understood this. He ordered strict secrecy around the hedgerow cutter project. The modified tanks were kept away from the front lines as much as possible. When they had to move, they moved at night. Tarps were sometimes thrown over the front of the tanks to conceal the teeth. Soldiers who knew about the project were ordered not to discuss it. No letters home mentioning the new tank attachment. No loose talk that might be overheard by spies or collaborators. This was a secret weapon, and it needed to stay secret until the moment it was unleashed. Did the Germans have any idea what was coming? The evidence suggests they didn't. German intelligence had failed to detect the mass production of hedgerow cutters. When Operation Cobra began, the appearance of Rhino tanks came as a complete surprise. Some German after-action reports described confusion about the new American tanks. How were they getting through hedgerows so easily? What kind of modification was this? By the time German commanders understood what was happening, it was too late. The breakout had begun. By July 25, 1944, the day Operation Cobra launched, hundreds of American tanks were equipped with Kulin hedgerow cutters. Not every tank had one. The goal of 3 per platoon wasn't fully achieved everywhere. But enough tanks were modified to fundamentally change the dynamics of the battle. 11 days earlier, American armored units had been stuck in a meat grinder. Now, they were about to break through, and the bocage would never stop them again. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra begins. The plan was straightforward in concept. Massive aerial bombardment to soften German positions, followed by an armored thrust through the weakened lines. The goal was to punch a hole in the German defenses and exploit it before the enemy could recover. Simple in concept, horrifically complex in execution. The bombardment phase did not go smoothly. Due to confusion about bomb lines, the markers indicating where friendly forces ended and enemy territory began, some American bombs fell on American positions. Over 100 American soldiers were killed by friendly fire, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking officers to die in the war. He was observing the bombing from what was supposed to be a safe position. It was a tragic start to what would become a triumph. But despite the terrible cost, the bombardment achieved its purpose. German forward positions were devastated. Communications were disrupted. Reinforcements couldn't get through the cratered roads. And then the tanks came. This is where the Rhino tanks proved their worth. In previous weeks, American advances in the Bocage had been measured in yards. A good day might mean capturing 1 or 2 fields. Casualty rates were enormous. With the hedgerow cutters, everything changed. The modified Shermans didn't climb the hedgerows. They tore through them. The teeth ripped into the embankments, shredding roots and dirt, creating breaches that infantry and other vehicles could follow. German soldiers who had been confident in their defensive positions found themselves suddenly exposed. The hedgerows that had protected them for weeks were now being demolished in seconds. The psychological impact was immense. German defensive doctrine in the Bocage relied on the hedgerows as natural fortifications. Every position was chosen with the assumption that attackers would have to climb over or go around. Artillery was pre-registered on the gaps between hedgerows. But what happens when the enemy can create new gaps anywhere they want? The whole defensive system collapsed. American tank infantry teams developed new tactics on the fly. A Rhino tank would approach a hedgerow. It would cut through, emerging into the next field with its gun ready. Immediately, it would engage any German position's visible machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, whatever was there. Meanwhile, infantry would follow through the breach. They would spread out along the hedgerow, clearing any remaining Germans and securing the field. Then the process would repeat. Cut through, engage, clear, repeat. Field after field fell. Mile after mile was covered, and the Germans couldn't stop it. But I don't want to make this sound too easy. War is never easy. Soldiers were still dying. Let me show you what those battles actually looked like. The fighting in Operation Cobra was intense and brutal. The hedgerow cutters gave American tanks an advantage, but the Germans were still elite soldiers with dangerous weapons. Panzerfaust could still destroy Shermans at close range. German 88mm guns, probably the best anti-tank weapon of the war, could penetrate Sherman armor from distances the Shermans couldn't match. The difference was that now, the Shermans could fight. They weren't helpless targets cresting hedgerows. They could engage the enemy on something closer to even terms. One veteran later described the experience of being in a Rhino tank. You'd hit the hedgerow, and it was like pushing through heavy mud. You could feel the whole tank strain. But then you'd break through, and suddenly you're in the next field, and you're scanning for targets. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Terrifying and exhilarating. That's war in 2 words. The German response was desperate. Some units tried to reinforce the hedgerows, piling additional obstacles behind them. But this took time they didn't have. Others tried to fall back to secondary positions. But the American advance was too fast. Before new defensive lines could be established, Rhino tanks were already cutting through. By the second day of Operation Cobra, the German front was beginning to crack. By the third day, it was shattered. The numbers tell the story. Before Operation Cobra, American forces had advanced about 7 miles inland from the beaches in 6 weeks. 7 miles in 42 days. In the first week of Operation Cobra, they advanced over 30 miles. The breakout was real. The Bocage nightmare was over. And it kept going. On August 1st, 1944, General George Patton's Third Army was activated. Patton was famous for aggressive, rapid armored warfare. He was exactly the right commander for the exploitation phase. With the hedgerows behind them, American tanks could finally do what they were designed to do: move fast and hit hard. Patton's forces raced across France. They liberated Brittany. They swung east toward Paris. They trapped entire German armies. By the end of August, Paris was free. The Allied forces were pushing toward Germany itself. The war wasn't over by a long shot, but the stalemate in Normandy was broken forever. And all of this, the breakout, the liberation, the momentum that carried the Allies to victory, traces back to a sergeant with a simple idea. Let me tell you what happened to Curtis Cullen. In the chaos of war, it's easy for heroes to get lost. Paperwork gets misplaced. The chain of command gets confused. Sometimes, the people who make the biggest contributions aren't properly recognized. For a while, that nearly happened to Curtis Cullen. In the initial reports about the hedgerow cutters, Cullen's name was sometimes omitted or misspelled. Credit was occasionally given to others. The fog of war made it difficult to track exactly who had invented what. But General Bradley remembered. In the weeks and months after Operation Cobra, Bradley made sure that Cullen received recognition for his invention. He was awarded the Legion of Merit, a prestigious decoration for exceptionally meritorious conduct. The citation praised Cullen for his ingenuity and mechanical skill in developing the hedgerow cutter. It noted that his invention had materially assisted in the breakout from Normandy. Materially assisted. Military understatement at its finest. The hedgerow cutter didn't just assist. It was one of the most important tactical innovations of the Normandy campaign. But Cullen didn't get to enjoy the recognition for long. On July 29, 1944, just 4 days after Operation Cobra began, Cullen was seriously wounded in combat. Shrapnel from a German artillery shell hit him, causing injuries severe enough to end his combat service. He was evacuated to England, then back to the United States. The man who had given American tanks the ability to break through hedgerows never saw the final victory his invention helped achieve. Cullen survived the war. He returned to civilian life, eventually settling in Long Island, New York. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime contributions. In interviews, he was modest almost to a fault. He deflected credit to others, the maintenance crews who built the devices, the commanders who saw their potential, the soldiers who used them in battle. "I just had an idea," he reportedly said. "A lot of people made it work." That modesty is both admirable and frustrating, because the idea mattered. Without Cullen's insight, without his persistence in pushing the concept up the chain of command, the hedgerow cutters might never have been built. Someone else might have eventually invented something similar. But when? In 2 more weeks? A month? How many more soldiers would have died in those hedgerow fields while waiting for a solution? Cullen's idea came at exactly the right moment, and that timing saved lives. Hundreds of lives. Maybe thousands. Curtis Cullen Jr. died on May 15, 1963. He was 48 years old. His New York Times obituary was brief, just a few sentences noting his invention and his military service. He's buried in Long Island National Cemetery, among thousands of other veterans. Most people who visit that cemetery have no idea they're walking past the grave of one of World War II's most innovative thinkers, a cab driver who changed history. But the story doesn't end with Cullen. The lessons of the hedgerow cutter lived on, and they still matter today. The Cullen hedgerow cutter is studied in military academies around the world, not just as a piece of World War II history, but as a case study in innovation under pressure. What makes this story so instructive? Let me break it down. First lesson: innovation can come from anywhere. Cullen wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He was an enlisted man sergeant, which is a relatively junior rank. In a rigid hierarchical organization like the military, his ideas shouldn't have mattered. But they did, because he was on the ground. He was seeing the problem firsthand, every day. He was watching friends die. That visceral, immediate experience gave him insights that generals and headquarters simply couldn't have. The best ideas often come from the people closest to the problem, not from the people farthest removed from it. Second lesson: improvisation beats perfection. The hedgerow cutters weren't perfect. Different units made different versions. There was no standardized design, no official manual, no formal testing process. And it worked anyway, because in a crisis, you don't need perfect. Most people who visit that cemetery have no idea they're walking past the grave of one of World War II's most innovative thinkers, a cab driver who changed history. But the story doesn't end with Cullen. The lessons of the hedgerow cutter lived on, and they still matter today. The Kulin Hedgerow Cutter is studied in military academies around the world, not just as a piece of World War II history, but as a case study in innovation under pressure. What makes this story so instructive? Let me break it down. First lesson: innovation can come from anywhere. Kulin wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He was an enlisted man sergeant, which is a relatively junior rank. In a rigid hierarchical organization like the military, his ideas shouldn't have mattered. But they did, because he was on the ground. He was seeing the problem firsthand, every day. He was watching friends die. That visceral, immediate experience gave him insights that generals and headquarters simply couldn't have. The best ideas often come from the people closest to the problem, not from the people farthest removed from it. Second lesson: improvisation beats perfection. The Hedgerow Cutters weren't perfect. Different units made different versions. There was no standardized design, no official manual, no formal testing process. And it worked anyway, because in a crisis, you don't need perfect. Most people who visit that cemetery have no idea they're walking past the grave of one of World War II's most innovative thinkers. A cab driver who changed history. But the story doesn't end with Kulin. The lessons of the Hedgerow Cutter lived on, and they still matter today. The Kulin Hedgerow Cutter is studied in military academies around the world, not just as a piece of World War II history, but as a case study in innovation under pressure. What makes this story so instructive? Let me break it down. First lesson: innovation can come from anywhere. Kulin wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He was an enlisted man sergeant, which is a relatively junior rank. In a rigid hierarchical organization like the military, his ideas shouldn't have mattered. But they did, because he was on the ground. He was seeing the problem firsthand, every day. He was watching friends die. That visceral, immediate experience gave him insights that generals and headquarters simply couldn't have. The best ideas often come from the people closest to the problem, not from the people farthest removed from it. Second lesson: improvisation beats perfection. The Hedgerow Cutters weren't perfect. Different units made different versions. There was no standardized design, no official manual, no formal testing process. And it worked anyway, because in a crisis, you don't need perfect. You need good enough right now. How much time is wasted in organizations waiting for perfect solutions while imperfect problems keep causing damage? Kulin's approach was build something, test it, fix it as you go. Speed mattered more than polish. Third lesson: use what you have. The Hedgerow Cutters were made from German beach obstacles. The Allies didn't need to ship special materials from factories in England or America. They used debris that was literally lying on the ground. There's something poetic about that the Germans' defensive preparations became the raw material for their defeat. But there's also a practical lesson. The solution to your problem might be sitting right in front of you, overlooked because you're looking for something else. Fourth lesson: leadership makes the difference. Kulin had the idea, but General Bradley had the authority to implement it. Without Bradley's immediate recognition of the Hedgerow Cutter's value, without his order to mass-produce them right away, the invention might have been buried in bureaucracy. How many good ideas have been lost because the people with authority didn't listen? How many problems persist because leaders are too proud or too busy to take input from below? Bradley listened. Bradley acted. And that made all the difference. Fifth lesson: secrecy can be a force multiplier. The Hedgerow Cutters were kept secret until Operation Cobra. When they appeared on the battlefield, the Germans were caught completely off guard. If the Germans had known about the devices in advance, they might have prepared countermeasures. Deeper fortifications, different tactics. Anti-tank ditches are too wide for even the modified tanks to cross. But they didn't know. And by the time they figured it out, the battle was lost. Information is a weapon, too. These lessons apply far beyond military history. They apply to business, to technology, to personal challenges. Sometimes the solution to your impossible problem is simpler than you think. Sometimes it comes from an unexpected source. Sometimes you just have to build something and see if it works. So where do we see Kulin moments in the modern world? Let me give you some examples. Silicon Valley loves to talk about garage startups Companies that began with a couple of people and a rough idea, no formal resources, just determination and improvisation. Apple was literally started in a garage. So is Amazon. So is Google. The pattern is the same. Someone close to a problem had an insight that experts had missed. They built something with whatever they had available. They iterated quickly, fixed problems on the fly, and moved faster than established players. Sound familiar? In medicine, some of the most important innovations have come from practitioners in the field, not researchers in laboratories. The idea for using Viagra to treat heart conditions came from nurses who noticed, let's call it an unexpected side effect. The use of maggots to clean wounds was rediscovered by battlefield medics who observed that soldiers with maggot-infested wounds actually healed better than those without. Goals? Yes. Effective? Also yes. The common thread is this. The people dealing with problems directly often have insights that experts lack. This doesn't mean expertise is worthless. Far from it. But expertise can also create blind spots. Sometimes you need someone without preconceptions to look at a problem fresh. A cab driver from New Jersey is looking at German beach obstacles and seeing tank teeth. Let me leave you with one more modern example. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic created a worldwide shortage of medical ventilators, engineers at major universities started designing open-source ventilator alternatives.